Okay, let's do it. Well, Eric, it's very nice to have you here with us. I'll do a quick introduction and kind of reiterate for everyone on the line and listening what we're doing and why we're here. And then maybe you can introduce yourself, and we'll go from there with questions and conversation.
Sounds great. Thanks for having me.
Excellent. So I'm Rebekah Rombom. I'm Chief Business Development Officer at Flatiron School. Flatiron School is a school for transformational technology education. We teach things like data science, software engineering, and cybersecurity to folks who are changing careers. And we also partner with corporations, universities, governments, various entities to bring those trainings to their employees, students, constituents. And we're joined by Eric Weber, Head of Data Product at Yelp, to talk a little bit about continuous learning in technology and trends in data science. I know that a lot of folks I've spoken to are kind of grappling with the same thing, that technology changes so fast. And how do we even know what the trends are and what they're going to be? And also how do we optimize for learning on our team to keep up with all the skills that we're going to need, tomorrow that we don't actually need today. And when Eric and I last chatted, he had a lot of really interesting stuff to say about that. So hopefully this is conversational and a lot of you sharing what you know. But why don't you go ahead and give us a little bit about your background, introduce yourself.
Awesome. First of all, thanks for having me. And I think the topics we're going to jump into will be relevant, not just now, but hopefully 2 years later, or 2 years from now, if people listen to something like this. We aren't having exactly the same discussions, though, based on the last 10 years, the more things change, the more they kind of do stay the same, like when it comes to the problems we're facing. So I lead our data product group, specifically a few areas at Yelp. So that would be our product experimentation, product analytics, our economic insights group, and basically how we capture and store data. So what that means is my group, as a group of product managers and engineering teams and data scientists, are responsible for thinking about how do we leverage data to create essentially better product decisions. So it's really like product centric, right? There's certainly parts of companies that are focused on reporting to Wall Street, those type of things. My part of Yelp is really focused on how do we create and shape data in a way that allows us to inform the product decisions that we make. Not that we're always going to make the right ones, but that we have at least fairly good hypotheses about what to do and what to do next, and also can read out how effective some of our decisions have been. So I came to Yelp basically right at the start of the pandemic. I'm in Chicago now. That's what you see in the background. But at the time, I was in Southern California and was planning to move back to San Francisco. And obviously, I didn't quite move directly north. I went northeast, and I'm in the Chicago area. And like Yelp, like many organizations, has had to figure out what we're going to do next. And like, as we've said publicly, we are basically going remote first, and that is true from our executive leadership team on down. And so with that, we've had to grapple with a lot of changes, challenges, rethinking, like how do we handle certain things when we used to depend on in-office environments. So super excited to talk through some of these different things. And also, as much as I'll probably try to tell you what I think, I'll also say I don't know a lot of things. And there's a lot of things to be determined, which I think is most interesting.
Yeah, and we can definitely touch on some of that kind of remote work and what's happened over the last year and a half as well. I know technology teams a lot of them are organizing for kind of the long haul of either hybrid or remote first. Before we get into that, we spoke a little bit last time we talked about what brought you to Yelp and why that particular role and that positioning of how to use data was interesting to you. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think Yelp, in a lot of ways, is part of a smaller group of companies that are trying to think about how to actually manage the data products that they build, really like products. I think there's a lot of attention to how do we create sustainable value out of the investments that we're making. And I think we're at a point now where data science has been around. When I say long enough, that's really weird to say given that it hasn't been that long, but we're running into a place where the question of how to create sustainable value from our investments is a key question that companies have. And Yelp is really focused on this data product as a space, which is basically a cross between data science and product management, and trying to think about what does it mean to actually invest in this space for the long haul. And I think other companies are headed in this direction. I think Twitter and Netflix are good examples of other companies that have built up this type of organization, but a lot of us are still figuring it out. And to me, that's a very compelling thing to be a part of, which is, we have a strong brand name, we have a large organization, but a strong brand name and a large organization and spending money on data doesn't guarantee effectiveness for the company. And so it's really kind of an interesting problem to focus on. And like that for me, I always am interested in focusing on problems that have not really been resolved. And I think that's what has me at Yelp and has me really engaged in some of our product areas and discussions.
That's interesting. So maybe kind of a follow-up on that. How do you spot that opportunity inside a business? It sounds like that's something that you look for professionally, is building product out of, like, building a product opportunity out of data, building a business behind what we do with these reams of information. How do I know if my company has that opportunity or should be leveraging that opportunity? What would that look like?
It would be surprising to me if most companies didn't have an opportunity. I think it becomes the question of like, there are a couple dimensions, which is like, how feasible is it that the opportunity is going to be available in the near term, right? There are some companies that need to do certain things, but for various reasons, it's very hard to make that type of investment at this moment in time. And so I think that's, if you're thinking about your own company, one of the challenges is that a lot of times we recognize what needs to happen, but the doing it really requires a lot. It usually requires like leadership support. It requires having people and the right investment. So one dimension is like thinking about feasibility. And the second dimension, I think, is also prioritizing what needs to happen first. You can't just like make everything related to data good all at once. And so it's a question of like, where do I start? And so that question of like where to start is really, really important. And if you're not at the place where you can say, this is what I would do first, then you may not quite be ready to go down that path. I think once you're ready, you're going to recognize this clear first step that you would make. And that's easier said than done. But I've noticed a lot of companies even outside of big tech companies are at the place now where they're talking about doing product experimentation, or they're talking about building a sustainable way to view and use dashboards across the company. And like that type of energy makes it much more likely that you actually have a chance to succeed. So I think like the feasibility component, and then a sense of what would you do first, if you can kind of give the affirmative to feasibility and have a sense of what you would do first, then in my mind, you're ready to at least begin moving down the path. And obviously there's other challenges that come up along the way.
And what is it possible to give an example that's, not confidential from Yelp?
Sure. I think for us, so I'll think about product experimentation, and to ground this as much as I can, like you're trying to do fairly simple, like at the simplest level, an A/B experiment to try to determine like if you should change something in your product and like what impact that change may have downstream on your users and your revenue, whatever it may be. A lot of companies are grappling with this idea of should we do experiments, because they are interested in like actually identifying causation, right? Analytics has a fairly hard ceiling on like, okay, we can see things, but as far as attribution to cause, it's very challenging to do. So people are interested in experimentation. And what's happening is there are companies, Yelp is one of them, that has approached this from we're going to build our own capability internally. And that really requires a big investment, large engineering teams, product managers, data scientists to be able to manage this platform. Essentially, this capability is something that we're investing in. But there's also an opportunity to talk about how else do you get to that place. And one of those is like you can buy external products. Like Amplitude Experiments was just launched Darkly as another example. And so this is a broader issue of, okay, we want to do this thing, right? In this case, make better product decisions that are causal. We have different paths to get there. We could build our own stuff, or we could go pay an external vendor and integrate them into our company. Both things may allow you to ultimately have a similar outcome. But again, this is a very practical idea of like the build versus buy conversation is not a super easy one to navigate. If you want to build something internally, you have to think about like, what's that going to take? If you want to use an external vendor to develop a capability, which one do you pick? How do you evaluate if they're the right fit for your company? Like, this is a practical thing that a lot of companies are going to grapple with as this like data space becomes more and more fragmented over time. There are more and more options for engaging with external vendors. And this is where like data product management and kind of taking product manager cues from other disciplines makes a big difference, because you're actually helping the company decide how they should approach a really tough problem that's really key to their growth. And to me, this is true of analytics, this is true of experimentation, metrics, all sorts of different data things.
Yeah, we've definitely talked about, right, there's experimentation and then there's productizing experimentation as part of your product approach, which I think require two very different kinds of investments. That's a good point. Switching gears a tiny bit, you came from academia. You started your career in academia, and you keep a professorship, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
Why do you keep a foot in the academic world, and why move into industry in the first place?
The overall answer is fairly easy in that I love teaching. Like, teaching is probably where I find, like, I don't know, most enjoyment. Like, when I'm doing it, I get a lot of utility out of it. I enjoy like being in a classroom, having that dynamic. Ultimately, I keep the teaching, and like, because I think I'll probably never, like, it'll always be a part of kind of what I do. Just a question of like, what percentage of my time and like, am I dedicating to it? I would imagine later in my career that percentage will go up. It's ultimately, I think, once I have the ability to actually take what I've learned in industry and to translate that into classrooms in a more effective way, that's a big opportunity, and also something where I feel like I can really contribute. As far as a move to industry, I think if you asked me that question then versus now, then I would have said like, I want things to move faster. And I would have said, careful what you wish for, like, and how fast you want things to move. I also just really wanted a chance to think about what it meant to build and apply these things in like industry settings, right? Not necessarily in we have applied courses all over the place in universities, but it's typically application of techniques. But what's hard is actually applying it within an organization full of people. And you kind of figure out like what actually works. once you're in a big organization. The technical solutions aren't always the primary thing that organizations are optimizing on. And so for me, I'm like pretty constantly trying to figure out like what actually works, and how do you like work in the context where you have technical solutions, but you also have to meet this like really tough constraint of what people want and need in a particular moment for the business. And honestly, I think that's what is most interesting to me, is that it's actually a really challenging problem. But at the same time, I also still get to teach in industry, right? Which is like, you work in a space that is kind of a black box to a lot of people. And so you naturally get opportunities to teach. It's just kind of a question of like, if you take them or not. And I definitely enjoy like using those opportunities to help people, instead of just saying the words machine learning at people over and over again, which is not effective. Like, walk them through, like, what does this actually mean? What does it actually do for you?
That's what I was going to ask next. So this seems like a good place to kind of talk about, clearly you love to teach, you've got this experience kind of growing up a little bit in academia, you still teach. How do you do that inside the organization? I think when we spoke, you talked about your own team, practitioners who are working on this super fast moving technology, but then also the broader organization who might not understand what is being done over there.
Yeah, I think it's asking, like, if you're going to teach in industry, I think you have to ask a pretty clear question of like, what do you think people are interested in? And what do they need, right? People have to be motivated. Like, we're not giving people grades at the end of the day. They don't need to take a course necessarily in order to like get their salary or get a promotion or anything. And so the set of incentives is like, typically, how do you meet people where they are and actually like convince them that it's useful to engage in discussion or teaching? So in some cases, there's like formal training and courses that we create just because it actually helps people be more effective at their jobs. And that effectiveness translates into promotions, raises, like daily effectiveness in their work. Also, like, there's a lot of non-standard teaching opportunities. Like, it's very rare that you're going to get a 45-minute uninterrupted lecture style conversation in business. Like, it's just not going to happen. But instead, you're probably going to have things like maybe 1 or 2 minutes to introduce and help people think about a topic in a new way. And it's actually like the latter type of opportunity that I'm most interested in, which is, how do I actually like use the time that I have to like help people understand what we're trying to do and to move it forward. And like, I think teaching and learning happens in like lots of small chunks. It doesn't usually happen in nice 45-minute sessions. And so if you think about it, if you look at a meeting schedule and there's like, you have 5 minutes on the calendar or on the agenda, like, what are you going to do with the 5 minutes, right? Are you going to give status updates, or are you going to actually talk through and help people understand something? That's where I find a lot of interest and a lot of the challenge to be.
Could you give an example here? Is there a time when you've brought someone along on learning journey through this?
Sure. I think it's pretty common. I use experimentation because it's technical enough that it's an example of something that's not standard to know, but also like it's tangible enough. Like an A/B test is our simplest type. So when we talk about experimentation, people broadly are like familiar with the idea that like it's probably a good thing to do when it comes to product development. But it's hard to know like what it means to be skilled at it, right? Like, what do they have to know that's going to allow them to actually like create an experiment that's effective? So if I'm talking to product managers, it's trying to think about like, what are like 3 things that you can actually do that are going to create more reliable and strong experiments when you run them. If I'm talking to an executive group, it's saying like, here's the type of investment it requires for us to like actually make this have a measurable impact on our business. And here's how we get better at it as an organization. And so part of that is just like removing some of the black box idea of like, okay, it's actually not as unfriendly as you might have thought, right? When people hear the words machine learning or experimentation, it often just like conjures up images of like super complex math and statistical design. And immediately people kind of are just like, nope, I'm out. And when you can move past that and talk about like the practical ways to think about it, it becomes less intimidating, and people are almost automatically more engaged when they don't just see it as a collection of like symbols and complex math, which I think is super important.
And what do you think, sorry for the new people who might have joined in the interim since I last said this, my crying baby is at home in my tiny New York City apartment. So if you hear her, don't worry about her, she's fine. But I feel like I have to acknowledge her in the background. What do you think about kind of how that works at, you know, if I'm an L&D professional or a data leader and I'm thinking about, man, what does my executive team need to know as far as data science or data product? Are there topics that you'd encourage folks to actively share about within the organization?
So I think if I ask this question to like all of the product managers, especially technical ones, they would all say like, they need to know my area. They need to understand it. And so that immediately tells me that like, that's, first of all, I don't think that's accurate. I think they need to know how it potentially is impactful for their business. And like, on one hand, you could talk about it actually creates upside and like revenue growth, which is if we do this like experimentation or analytics, we try to like attribute these back to like potentially revenue facing decisions. And so it's like, okay, if we did this in a more effective way, like if we had a clearer metric for understanding churn, for example, then we could spot churn earlier, detect it earlier. It might be something like that. That can be and in that case, they don't need to know everything about the how. They need to know more about the why. And I think sometimes when we try to teach people, we gravitate toward the how. Like you need to know all of like the stuff here. But actually, I think the why is quite important, which is like, what do you get out of this? And so that's a revenue upside. I think there's also an approach where you talk about risk mitigation, which is a lot of the reason that we invest in data. It's not just about making better decisions. It's actually about removing risk from, it could be like metrics that you report to Wall Street. It could be the consistency. Do you have good governance around the data that you have? Are you ensuring that you're not going to get hacked and have everything get released? Like both of these things, revenue growth and upside, and also like de-risking things can be powerful, but you don't necessarily need to teach people all of the details about how things work. You kind of need to look at their role in the organization and think about like, what kind of decisions are they trying to make? For an executive team, if they're deciding like strategically where to invest, then it's probably the why type of question. Now, if you're getting to work with product managers who might have to care about the details of like something actually working or not working and how to make something better, maybe you actually introduce some of the details about how something works. It almost has to be catered to not just who they are in the org, but also like, what are they doing on a day-to-day basis, if that makes sense.
No, I think that's a super useful point of view, right? You're kind of saying, as an expert, it's my responsibility to demonstrate the value of my function to whatever level or function I'm talking to, right? And that looks super different for executives who need to know, you know, we spend $1 million on this team. What are we getting for that $1 million? Versus a product manager who's maybe managing the details of an implementation. That conversation is pretty different. I think that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So
someone is hammering in my background. So between the two of us, we have just like a whole collection of noises going on.
Yeah, I think over the last year and a half, I've you know, had the baby join us and been working from home and have learned how to mostly concentrate on whatever's going on the screen for short periods. We've got usually construction and jackhammers and honking horns outside too. They've abated for the moment. And how do you think about that on your team? I'd imagine with the approach you just shared, that looks pretty different on a technical team of practitioners. How do you make sure the folks on your team have the skills that you need to do the work that needs to get done at the pace that it moves?
Yeah, I don't think there's a single perfect answer. I think so when people are at the company, and I need to think about, and they need to think about, what does it take to be successful in their role, right? And I think it is often very role dependent, right? In experimentation, there's a lot of industry knowledge, there's a lot of technical depth that's required to be proficient here. And ultimately, to make good decisions for the company, you have to be aware of what other companies have chosen to do and why they've chosen to do it. In an analytics space where certain capabilities are more of a commodity, like dashboard creation, you may not need to be like the expert, but you do need to understand in depth what your company is trying to do with that capability. And so it varies a bit depending on the type of product area, but ultimately, I think a good proxy way to think about it is, if you had this opportunity to build or buy a certain capability for your company, does that person know enough about the industry and what's available and the positives and negatives of different approaches to be able to answer the question of like, what do you think we should do? And if they can answer, what do you think we should do, and follow up with, this is why, and this is how it compares to different options out there, that's a pretty good proxy for like having enough technical fluency to be able to answer that question. And so if I thought about trying to establish a bar, it would kind of be like, do you know enough to be able to answer that question of like, what do you think we should do in this moment? Because you don't have to know everything. You don't have to be like the world expert in an area, but you do need to know enough to answer that question.
And how much of the time, I think about that a lot for myself and my team too, not technical. And a lot of times we're going and finding information. And I know this is the case in technology teams too, right? You might not know that answer, but you know how to find it. How much of the time do you expect that your team is getting a question and going out and finding the right answer versus, you're hiring someone or your role description already has that knowledge baked in?
I would say it's fairly well. I think there's in an ideal world, I'm hiring people who already just have all of this knowledge, right? And then but we don't live in that world.
They don't exist.
And that's not how like the labor market works. And there are very few people that know everything about an area, and that's just fine. Like you said, to your point, it's a question of, what do they do when they don't know something? Do they have an idea of how they would get to a place where they can make a statement about it? Like, can they go find information? Can they digest it and give an opinion about it? Or are they going to default to, okay, I don't know, but here's what I think? And those like two approaches are very different, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's a tendency and I've just noticed this happen a lot, which is in companies where it's like, let's move faster and faster, instead of taking the time to like step outside your comfort zone when you don't know something. It's like, okay, I'm not really sure, but we're under a time constraint, so let's just like do this. And I want, people and product managers and leaders who are going to take the former approach, which is, let's take the time to figure out what the right choice is here. And so when it comes to, if you want to stand out in this type of space, your ability to show patience and also to know what you don't know is pretty important. Because honestly, like whether it takes an extra 2 weeks means it might feel like a lot in the moment, but 2 years from now, when we look back, that 2 weeks is not going to matter. Even if it feels like it will when you're in that moment in time.
That's actually I think that's well said, and I kind of recognize that as what we try to teach at Flatiron School when we're taking people sometimes that have no technical experience at all or technically contiguous experience and turning them into data scientists, software engineers. And above all else, that's part of our pedagogy is kind of how can we teach you how to go find the answer when you come against the question you don't understand or you don't know the answer to. Because we've seen so many times that the learning curve is just so steep. And the most valuable skill is how do I go get the information? How do I go get the answer? And how do I not just try to articulate an answer without the right information? We haven't talked about this before. Can you test for that? Do you test for that when you're hiring?
I think I don't think you can actually test for it. I think you can look at like signals that exist that are probably reasonable, which is like, what have you done previously in other roles? Like, or that, and it doesn't even have to necessarily be in the exact same role, but people's approaches to problem solving don't vary a lot across different contexts. Like this is what I'm not going to like be able to cite a journal article on that, but again, it's a pretty strongly held belief that I have, which is, the ways that people approach problems tend to be more similar across lots of different contexts than they are different. And so if you show that the ability to know what you don't know, which is something that I definitely ask for and ask people to be like, what happens when you run into a situation where you don't have the context or the background to be able to navigate it? And then walk me through, like, how do you work through that? That doesn't, honestly, I don't care if it's in the context of product or tech. But yeah, I can ask about it. End of the day, there's only so much insight you can get from what people say. And it's much more about like, what do they do? And this is where, whenever you have someone join a company, you are making an educated guess on how you think they'll do when you hire them, right? But honestly, I think you really get to show that ability in your first few months, because you're going to be dropped into situations where there is ambiguity and you're not going to know everything. I've never seen someone join a company and be completely comfortable with how the company works within a short period of time. And so I think you get the opportunity to show it. So when you're, thinking about wherever you're coming from, preparing for these type of roles, it isn't always that you have to have, okay, I have the exact experience that maps perfectly to this question. Like, you should just think about how you solve problems. How do you deal with ambiguity? Because those two things are pretty useful across tons of different types of roles.
Yeah, it's part of our evaluation process actually for candidates coming to the program when you don't have a technology background to look at is questions like that around approach to problem solving, approach to collaboration for problem solving, pulling information from various places when you don't have it yourself. So that's one of the things we've found predicts success in the program, and then going on to be to change careers and be a technologist. Okay, let's switch gears a little bit. So let's talk about data science trends. I actually don't know what you're going to say here because this is not my area of expertise at all. But I'm super curious. You've been running data science teams for 6 or 7 years. Mm-hmm. What's changed since then?
I think so of course, techniques change, technologies change. Like what people were using in 2014 and 15 is like dramatically different now. Particularly in terms of the underlying tech and the technical stacks that data scientists operate on. What hasn't necessarily changed, a lot of the problem spaces that people are trying to focus on have not changed that much, which is we're still trying to figure out how to get better data. We're still trying to figure out how to create models and approaches that can be explained to other people that aren't just black box. We're still trying to figure out how to like maintain things over time as technologies change, right? This like a lot of this stuff, I'm saying it very generically because I actually don't think it changes that much. The ways in which we do it, like the technology is always going to shift. There's going to be improvements that actually, in a lot of cases, make it easier for people to do things like in data science that would have been much harder to do 7 years ago. For example, like Databricks or Data Robot make it much easier to like create a model and deploy it. 7 or 8 years ago, it would have been much, much harder to do that. And so there are like technologies that are making it more efficient and more reliable to do important things for data science. But like, and so that will always change. And so when I look at trends now, the trends now that it's been around for long enough is that people, back to my point before, is people are trying to figure out how do we like get real value from doing this, right? It's not always like in 2014, you had to like go hire a data scientist because no one else knew how to fit a model or no one else knew how to do a certain thing.
Yeah.
But now that like those capabilities are more widespread, they're available to more people. Now it's like, okay, are we actually getting the value from this that we thought we were going to? And so that question, I think, has kicked into gear. Like this idea of data product actually is probably coming from that, which is how do we have someone focused on where our investments are going and focused on actually seeing value from the things that we want to do. And so I think that trend as what will continue to be there, which is we have some long held problems that are pretty consistent across multiple companies. And what's fascinating is a lot of the people who have solved these problems at scale, a lot of early employees at Airbnb or Uber who had to build up and build these original approaches have now started their own companies to do exactly that and try to give other companies access to these capabilities like metric development or data quality monitoring. And honestly, that's where a lot of the trends are at, which is this whole like you can build or buy a lot of capabilities now, primarily because people have started these other companies that enable you to purchase these kind of things as a product, which I think is pretty fascinating. And it's pretty chaotic at the moment too.
Well, what you're describing reminds me of what we saw in the software engineering market from say 2012 to 2016 or so, where all the hires needed to know how to use all the tools in the beginning of that period, right? Because there just wasn't that much agreement. There wasn't that much canon on what the job description is, on what the, what not necessarily a tool set, but the world of tools that were possible, what generally gets bought versus built. And so I wonder where you think we are on that kind of maturation cycle, where I've seen in software engineering and starting in data science and starting in cybersecurity, more openness to a diversity of backgrounds coming into the field as a practitioner, I assume because knowing everything about how the philosophy was developed and all of the foundational tools isn't required anymore. Practitioners still need to be really handy with the tools that they're using. But anyway, I wonder if you kind of see where we are in that cycle for data science.
I don't think it's fully opened the field up. I do think what has happened is there has always been and probably always will be a demand for PhD trained people in data science to do very specific types of things, right? Like they may have knowledge about a certain approach, a certain type of modeling that ends up being invaluable for a particular type of company. What it has done is it has created more opportunity for people who don't have that extremely deep coding background, who maybe they're more focused on statistics. Maybe they're more focused on, they were an analyst and so they know SQL really well. I think the availability of tools has opened up more opportunity for people in those spaces to step in and learn and actually become really effective data scientists. There's a whole bunch of weird market dynamics happening. One is like the cross of software engineering and data science into like ML engineers but I think the net effect is that more people are able to enter the field. the challenge also though is that I think the expectation, like most companies have wildly different expectations about what a data scientist should do. And I actually don't necessarily think that they're wrong. I think companies are actually saying, here's what I believe in the moment that I need. Now, whether that's reflective of reality, they're doing their best. They're looking at their peer companies and saying, this is what our competitors have been advertising for, so we probably need something similar. It's produced all sorts of like job descriptions that have 500 skills on them. And when it boils down to it, it's like, do you know Python? Do you know SQL? And are you comfortable with statistics? And if those things are true, then you have a real opportunity to break into this area. So to me, I think it remains to be seen like what the net effect of this, especially as we like have more data products enter the space, but I'm pretty curious to see where it goes.
Right. And like you said before, a bunch of skills that I know from experience hiring managers really do care about, like approach to problem solving and kind of what's your disposition around going to find information versus kind of defaulting to the information that you have tends to be important to folks, but often doesn't make it onto the job description.
Exactly, right? Job descriptions are a whole probably multi-hour conversation that are very, there's lots of strong feelings about job descriptions out there in the world.
That's definitely true. I think Molly has a question. Molly, if you want to type it into the chat or into the Q&A, happy to address that and any questions that you all have, as we have about 15 minutes left. Okay, great question. It seems like many small businesses rely on Yelp as a channel to connect them to their customers. Is Yelp running any analysis to predict the end of the pandemic? We talked about this a little bit.
I wish. So my team publishes something called the Yelp economic average. And you can look at, I think, how we've been leveraging our data, which is we can understand a lot of consumer behavior, like local consumer behavior and trends in that. And you can imagine that as the United States has had wildly different rules in different states and locales about reopening, and we've shown a lot of difference in like consumer trends and behavior, and also like what that looks like relative to like COVID in general. I think the end of the pandemic is something we all kind of wish for. I think we're in the mode of trying to respond to patterns that we see in traffic, right? Which is as cases spike and we have waves of COVID, like in certain states that dramatically ramps down like diner behavior. It drives up like people ordering from Uber Eats and from other spaces. And so more than anything, instead of trying to predict or forecast the future, we're trying to do better at reacting to the realities of the present, which actually is a really hard thing to do when you're in a pandemic and you have a business that like depends on tons of different areas. Like effectively it feels like a lot of days with like 20 different countries based on areas of the United States and their behavior. So we also like, so when it comes to like larger trends and forecasts, we try to rely on, a lot of experts who can actually do forecasting, but like forecasting is hard. And I think what you're seeing most businesses do is like the best we can do is react to what we know in the moment and use the data we have now. That said, yeah, if anyone came up with a real prediction for the end of it, I think it would make us all very happy. But again, we're doing our best with being more, in this case, reactionary, which is not ideal, but it's about the best we can do.
Well, and zooming up from that point, you've also you talked about how the pandemic has generated a new kind of data, or data that you're looking at in a new way, particularly for Yelp's business. But also just in general, how the amount of data in the world is exponentially increasing every year, a couple of years,
yeah,
at just an outstanding rate. How does that change the field in your view, or does it?
I I think my answer, I said before, say when you don't know. I don't think I know. I think I would be hesitant to make a holistic statement for the field. And I think it's more dependent on, like, in some companies that need to actually leverage all of the data they can collect and they can make use of it, it just creates more demand for processing power. And so like technology matters a lot more to those companies so they can actually leverage everything they collect. In other companies, it's actually important to then be very selective about what data you actually capture, what you store, and what you actually use. And so I think it can run on a continuum from like, are you able to capture everything you want and store it indefinitely and use it whenever you need, which would be present for companies that can afford to do that, versus many companies, the reality is data that's a year old probably isn't going to do much for them. And so they're much more focused on the present, what's happening now. And I think that creates questions about like, how much data should we collect and what value do we get from it? Most companies, I think, would not have a good answer if you asked which data sets are most valuable to you and like, how do you actually measure that value? But ultimately, like as the volume of data increases, it's very unlikely that technology and processing can keep pace with that growth in data. And so you actually have to make a decision, which is like, what data are we going to collect and how are we going to use it? Which I think is very tricky, because the tendency up to this point has been to just, okay, let's just grab it all, toss it into a model and see what factors are most important. But what if you can't do that? How are you going to approach that? That to me is a super hard question and also a very interesting one that we don't have a really good answer for.
Right, which brings us back to, again, some of the kind of softer strategy pieces you were talking about with what makes someone a successful leader, or a successful kind of practitioner who grows with the industry. Seeing some of those trends that, we're going to have to approach the way that we're capturing and storing data completely differently in 5 years.
Yeah.
Totally different skill set than how well do you know Python, how well do you know SQL, how well do you know stats?
Yes.
Maybe one last question. We talked a little bit about kind of like what the organization needs to know about all, your specific area, and I liked your approach a lot of kind of taking accountability for demonstrating the value. But is there anyone you've worked with in your career who's not a data person or not a technical person, that drove a really good working relationship with you or your team? And how did they work and why was that?
Most of the, if I think about like transformational people that I've worked with, I would say, at least half, probably more, are just not technical in their background. They are often like business leaders. They understand like marketplaces. They understand how people, why people make decisions, how they make decisions. Ultimately, like technology is a part of a broader set of tools that you use to try to like generate value for people. And so like when I think about marketing executives who like help me think about and partner with to actually come up with really interesting new products for marketers or campaigns to create externally, or in sales, like what does it mean to create an effective sales organization? Like how do you actually structure that? What customers do you go after? Or in product, which is like, how do you know which offers to give to which people? Like so much of that does not come from people who have a quote unquote technical background. It comes from people who understand the consumer or the biz they're trying to sell to really, really well. And they can often like give you a sanity check on like, is your technical solution you're talking about, does it actually make sense? Or are you just like so deep into the data that you have lost grounding in reality of what we're trying to do? And that, I think it's when you get that partnership between like technical parts of the business and those type of people, you see like really cool things happen that actually like move the needle.
Yeah, the more things change, right? I think those are two of
Yes,
my kind of
absolutely.
golden rules. Is what are we trying to
Absolutely.
accomplish, and are we accomplishing it? Got to know those two things. So it sounds like we might have some people today who are trying to get into the field or learn more about it. Any books or resources you would recommend for folks in that position?
I think I've posted about it before, but like Data Science for Business is a classic example. I'm trying to think, like I can share it out after, but it's a very accessible book. I think it's fairly easy to digest. It's not extremely technical, but at least it approaches technical topics and helps you think about them. Introduction to Statistical Learning is a more, not surprisingly by the title, is definitely something that requires you to have at least like basic statistical background, but it gives you like, I think, a very practical approach to like the types of problems that can be addressed with like fairly standard data science techniques. The upside to that second one is that it's publicly available. And so you can just download it, a digital version. It's free. So I tend to gravitate towards those two books because they're technical enough that you get a grounding in like what data science is trying to do, but they're also not so deep that you'll just like get 2 pages in and stop reading, which is a pretty common occurrence for people who are trying to get started in this space.
Fair enough. Good advice. Don't try to plow through the book that's the most technical. Just start with one that's a little less.
It doesn't go super well.
Okay.
Awesome.
Anything else that I didn't ask that you should have answered?
I think we covered most things. I mean, like I said before, it'll be interesting to see like 2 years from now, like what do things look like? The 2 years, it's crazy that, we're almost to the end of 2021 because so much has happened in like, not just the world, but even in this space. And that's, I think, part of what I love about being in this area is like, you don't get to like just get comfortable. That's not how it works. And that's super interesting. And I think a lot of people who thrive in this space find that to be pretty compelling.
I like it. Good parting words. Yeah. For better or worse, we've chosen careers where you can never get super comfortable.
Exactly, right.
It's not boring.
Awesome.
Well, thanks, Eric, and everyone on the line. We will email out a follow-up with a recording in the next couple days. Thanks for joining us. Thanks, Eric. And hopefully I'll see you soon.
All right. Thanks for having me, Rebekah.
All right. Bye.